Yeah, I've met most of you guys, and I've kind of fell in love with the V77 years ago, probably pushing 30 years ago. But I mean, when you look at the wing design, how can you not like it? I mean, with the ones sitting out on the ramp, you even walk up to it, you know, they're just gorgeous airplanes. Now this is a picture of mine. It's serial number 443. It's built towards the last of the run. And you'll often hear them referred to by various names. One is the 1819, which is the Air Corps, and that's Advanced Trainer 19. You'll hear called the V77 for Vol T 77. And then the British and a lot of other people end up calling it the Reliant or Gullwing. So it's the same airplane, just a lot of different names for it. The only reason it's around is late in 39, 1940, when the Germany started bombing Great Britain, they needed to figure out a place to send their training squadrons so they could continue to train their air crews. Plus, they wanted to keep most of their homeland aircraft at home. So they came to the U.S. looking for various airplanes. One they really liked was the SR-10, this thing's predecessor. And they thought originally they were going to be able to buy enough off the used airplane market to fill the needs. Well, of course, there weren't enough available. And so they started looking at various manufacturers, and that's where Stinson kind of scooped in. They built them a cabin mock-up of the airplane with kind of some of the stuff they needed inside. And the British thought, well, this is pretty cool, so we'll stick with the Stinson design. One fallacy you'll often hear is that the V77 is just an SR-10, but they're really totally different airplanes. And one, as you'll see, this is the SR-10, and it's kind of hard to see, but this has got a single strut for the horizontal stab, whereas the V77 has a V strut. The SR-10 and a lot of the predecessory airplanes, the SR-9, SR-8, the main wing spar was 4130 steel, but it's heat treated. The V77, it was not heat treated, so it made it a lot more user-friendly for maintenance out in the field. You can't really tell from these two pictures, but the gear legs are different. V77s just angle out and go to the axle. SR-10 comes down, then drops vertically, then goes to the... What really changed the airplane, and you can't see it so much in the two pictures, but the V77 is about 2 feet longer, about 6 inches taller. And that did a couple things. One, it really helped some stability, especially in landing in a light load. It made the tail come down a lot easier. Slowed the airplane down a little bit, which it really didn't need to be slowed down. And it also, the V77 had a little bit higher dihedral than the SR-10 did. And of course, the biggest difference is the cowling. V77 had a smooth cowl versus this bumped cowl. It looks very attractive, but it's very difficult to remove. Now this is a picture of my airplane. I did it just the way the Royal Navy had it. And for their observer training, and their observer is just a navigator, is a radio operator, and a camera operator. They had these two huge radios in front. Bottom was a transmitter and a receiver. They had another receiver on their back bulkhead, which is basically a homing receiver. And they could train how to find the aircraft carrier once they were done with the mission, heading back home. It had 3 seats in the original airplane. That one back there, that's the observer or the training seat, and that was on a full swivel. So that could swivel around so you could access the chart board and the stuff in back. The co-pilot seat on the early serial numbers could also swivel. They figured out they didn't like the swivel mechanism with the radio in the way and all the rest of the stuff up there. So they made it so they could just reposition the seat forward or backwards, depending on what the mission of the day was going to be. And you look at these big bulky radios, and the 25 amp little airplane generator can power these things. So right below them are 4 just dry cell batteries. They'd use those up, pitch them out, replace them for the power supply. Also, yeah, also in the back of the cabin, those 2 yellow bomb-looking things are flame floats. And they're filled with phosphorus. So they'd be out over the water doing their work, and they'd drop through that little green hole in the floor. They'd hit the water smoke, then the student could come back around, they could do their drift sights and figure wind velocity and direction off of those. In addition to these little batteries, they had another huge battery located on the floor right below them. Again, just to power those bloody radios. Another thing they had on the outside of the cabin, they call them aperiodic compasses. And these would normally mount on the floorboard just behind that one observer seat. These things would mount outside, and they had a prism on the top looking at a backwards compass thing shot through a mirror. So you could take your line of sight off a couple of mountain peaks and figure out, well, there we are. And so those sat on the outside of the airplane.
Wow.
Primitive GPS.
These are pictures of your airplane?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Now the belly was set up, of course, for the big camera cone, so the camera lens could point right through the belly. That's where the flame float would come through. And then, of course, they had the 3 IFF lights, identification friend or foe. So hopefully the little 17-year-old ground gunner wouldn't be shooting at them. And you'll probably see a lot of the British airplanes all painted yellow for the trainers. Again, that was kind of a sign for the training airplane, so don't shoot my head. Don't shoot me. Total design of the airplane, I mean, it's so typically Stinson. It's got the double taper wing, both in chord and plan form, which really started off the, I forget which one of the tri-motors, the first low-wing tri-motor. They first started with this wing design. They figured out it was really kind of aerodynamically efficient. But the wing it's all metal. Like I mentioned, the main spar, which is a huge truss-type spar setup, is 4130 steel. It's got a made-up I-beam aluminum rear spar. The wing ribs are all square aluminum hollow tubing. The only wood in the wing is just the leading edge former. That kind of helps just keep the shape of the leading edge for the aluminum to fare around. It holds 76 gallons of gas, original from the factory. 2 tanks, all gravity fed to the engine. There's no pumps or anything for it. It's got the typical Stinson triangle windshield. Now this is on the original one. The factory one, the pilot window would roll up and down, just out of a 39 Chevy window crank. Has 1 cabin entry door, which all the previous airplanes, being civilian, of course, they'd have the 2 doors, right and left. One thing that I really care for, of course, I did mine with these big square cabin windows, is that first section slides backwards, and you get tremendous ventilation in the summer. The other thing is it really eliminates blind spots when you're out flying around. Again, back to the tail, it's got the V-struts. Now the early, say 150 airplanes had tailwheel locks, but the British hated them so much, they had them removed. They even hated them so much they sent service bulletins out to the field to have them removed. And it was kind of a crappy design, because right on the floorboard, on the right-hand side of the pilot seat, so you lean over to reach it, and of course you'd lose sight of the runway. And then any side loading on the pin, which she used during a crosswind day, it would jam the pin enough, it was real difficult to release. So the British should just get rid of the thing. So it's a full swiveling caster tail wheel. And I don't know how well this picture shows, but that's a wood prop. And intermixed with, and there's no rhyme or reason to the serial number, they had the aluminum bladed Hamilton Standard, or these wood props on the 2B20 hub. And a lot of these survived the war and were on the airplanes through the 60s before they finally changed them out. And it did lose about 5 knots in cruise speed, gained about 100 feet in takeoff distance with that wood prop. I mean, you gotta love that engine. It was a 300 horsepower, 9-cylinder Lycoming R680. And I mean, of all the small radial engines, I mean, that's just the most attractive thing I've ever seen. You know, when I got it back in the overall shop, I told my wife, I said, this needs to go to the living room. You know? Of course, you can see it didn't end up there. But I mean, they're absolutely, yeah. I mean, they're absolutely stunning engines. And with that is a constant speed controllable pitch, you know, 2B20 Hamilton Standard propeller. And you can see on this, the cowling setup, that takes about 20 seconds to open the side cowling on a V77. It's 6 quarter turns fasteners. The whole side props up and you stick it up with the cowl support rod. You got tremendous access for maintenance and inspection. One thing that extra 2 feet did for the fuselage length, it gave more room between the firewall and the back of the engine just for access to stuff. I mean, you can get in there and do almost everything you need just the way it sits. Really roomy. Has about a 4.5 gallon oil capacity and a quart an hour maybe if you're lucky, unless you're Brian's airplane. Yeah. And the right side is just the same. Lots of room for inspection. A real interesting thing is this still-looking thing, this copper piping, and that's the exhaust gas analyzer. They put those on during the war, and it sampled the exhaust gas as it departed the right-hand stack, sent it through this little black gizmo, displayed it in the cockpit from a 0.1 to 0.9. That's how you leaned it. Was through that thing. I don't think they were very accurate because they didn't seem to last the war, and you didn't see any of them after the war. Yeah. The interior again is Spartan military, and it's a floor button starter. That's just if you remember those old high beam buttons on your car, that's all the starter is to activate the starter. It's kind of a departure for Stinson. Before that, heel brakes on the rudder pedals. And this is the first one that they went to the toe brakes setup. And again, brakes only on the pilot side, just the rudder bars for the co-pilot. And you can kind of see here, there's the 2 nuts and bolts for that yoke on the control wheel. That was so when they swap that seat around, they could pull the control wheel, the yoke, and that mounting bracket totally off the airplane to give the guy's seat enough room. Had vacuum flaps, 2 position. It's full up or 35 degrees down. There's no in between. That's all you get. And an interesting deal is, being just a trainer for navigators, they didn't need the throttle quadrant anywhere where the co-pilot could touch it, which is probably a good deal. But as you look at it, if you look at the mixture, rich is all the way aft on that thing. Every airplane you've flown, everything full forward is for takeoff. Well, they had the rich in the back position. So on takeoff, the throttle's forward, the prop's forward, the mixture's backwards. But you think, well, what the heck are they doing that for? If you see that lever, while you're in cruise, of course, the throttle's going to be up here, the mixture might be around in this area. As you bring the throttle back to idle, that catch will grab the mixture and bring it automatically to full rich for you. So they did have a reason for it. But don't let some guy that doesn't know about that try to start your airplane. He'll be out there cranking and cranking. Of course, you're going to be thinking, oh, geez, what broke now? Of the first 5 airplanes were built, hand-built out of temporary jigs. The first one left Detroit and went to the right field in Ohio for the Army to test, the Air Corps to look at. And they figured out, well, we don't really care for the thing. They didn't need it. They thought it was underpowered, but they did say it flew real nicely. The next 3 flew down to Trinidad in the Caribbean to the Royal Navy squadron down there where they did operational testing. And the fifth one, this one, was shipped to England to the Aircraft Armament Experimental Establishment in Boscombe Downs. And the Brits did a lot of testing. And one thing they did is cold weather testing. One of the few that came with the heated pitot. Most did not have anything set up for winter flying. And they did a lot of carbon monoxide testing, high altitude flying. Well, high altitude meant 7,000 feet. But they did a lot more exhaustive flight testing. First 50 in the production run went down to Trinidad. And that's the ramp down at the end of the war, 752 Squadron in Piarco, Trinidad. And you can kind of see these markings on the top of the wing. They're the only squadron that marked the top with, and those are yellow striping. Again, to kind of identify that it's a training airplane and that don't shoot. But 81 eventually went to Trinidad and all the rest overseas.
Did they ship them or fly them?
Well, I was just going to mention that. Fancy you should ask. Yeah, the ones that went to Trinidad flew down there. And they went from Detroit down to Love Field, through Mexico, Central America, into South America, Venezuela, and they jumped over to Piarco. 56 hours of flying it took most of them to get down there. Whereas the rest of them went from Detroit over to Newark, were crated, and then shipped to the UK. And then they went from there to either Australia or the Far East. Like I said before, my airplane went to Australia. From everything I've been able to find, the only airplanes that really performed the mission they're designed in were the Piarco airplanes, the Trinidad ones. They're the only ones that really did the observer training. All the rest ended up as what they call them, admiral's barges, as they did. They hauled stuff. One guy even said, no, that radio rack was kind of, we didn't see him. There's no radios in the thing. And they just do personnel transport, small cargo stuff. And that supports the idea. Many of these, for example, my airplane, to date, it has 161 total hours since new.
Wow.
Because they went to the war, they hardly flew. I think some got to the war so late, I don't think they're uncrated, and they came back to the US. So some came back very, very low time, some under 100 hours. That was I got it kind of literally in a basket case. I mean, the parts were in boxes and baskets. And I bead blasted, of course, everything down to bare metal, both the fuselage and the wings. And I think Randy mentioned it a few summits ago. Restoring one of these, it's really takes a village. And this is when we went to put the wings on. Fortunately, there's a pipeline power patrol company on the field that had a forklift. And a bunch of 60-year-old, you've never heard so many 60-year-olds grunt and groan when they try to get up off the floor after putting all those. But, you know, again, it took, with all those guys there, it literally 2 hours to put the wings on and struts on and everything. But the forklift was very handy. After the war, 350 came back after the war. And here you can kind of see them unceremoniously packed on the deck of a carrier in Virginia as they came back.
Randy, was there any truth to 50 of them going down that never made it on the ship?
I've never been able to find that. I've tracked convoys that carried some of them,
Yeah.
but I could never find any records of what ships held what cargo to see. And I'm thinking that might be more of a wives' tale, because the U-boats, by the time, this is November 42, so it probably would have been early 43, and I think that the U-boat threat was pretty well resolved by 43. I did see that 12 were lost in Royal Navy service overseas, but I have kept looking to see if any were lost on convoys. You got to assume there were, but I've not found any record.
How many were built?
501 actually. Yeah. And the 350 came back, and they all went to the War Assets Administration for sale. In July of 46, they offered them for three prices: $1,500, $2,000, $2,500. And they were all disassembled, and that's kind of all based on condition. But you think, well, $2,000, that's nothing. But in 46, right after the war, it was like $3,100 or $31,000. That's a lot for a disassembled airplane. The other wives' tale out there is that Vultee bought them all back up and civilianized them and sold them into the private market. Every War Assets bill of sale I've seen, they all went to private owners. Just regular individual civilian types, some FBOs, a few small companies. None went to went to Vultee that I've seen. They just all went out to the marketplace, which makes sense because the small airplane market after the war was pretty saturated, and there weren't any sales. So why would these guys put all that money into them? And I don't think there would have been a return for them. After the war, they did a variety of missions, from ski planes in Alaska. Alaska Airlines had a bunch. Wien Air had some. They were great. Backcountry airplanes, whatever you could put in the door, you could get off the ground. You wouldn't go very high with it, but you could carry anything that you could fit in the airplane. Some ended up being real highly modified. Now, this is they all metallized this. As you can see, it's a parachute airplane. And I think that's a Pratt Whitney 1340 on it. And that one, eventually, the metal skin let go and the thing was in a fatal accident. But many in the 50s and 60s were modified for parachute use, again, because they were a great hauling airplane. They were air ambulance. This is with Mercy flights in Oregon. As a matter of fact, this is the airplane that's the one you rode up in South St. Paul. That one's still flying today. There's only one I've ever seen that has been put on floats. Since the Royal Navy had no call for a float option, Stinson never did the engineering. All their previous airplanes had float options, except for this one. This one stayed in the war, stayed in Europe after the war. It was bought by a Swedish national. And everything I've been able to find, sometime in the late 50s, in the early 50s, is put on floats. I won't even try to pronounce that operator written on the float. But it was in an accident, I think around 59, 61, and written off. But this is the only one I've ever seen on floats. Normally, they were all civilianized like this. You know, they changed the side windows, just a kind of a standard paint job. You might recognize this is hit Jody's airplane in Alaska in 1994, because there you can see the outline of your cabin setup.
And it's got that additional door that they have behind the entry door.
Yep.
So there's two doors.
Yeah.
They did that in Alaska.
Yep, and there it is in 94 with it. But that's kind of how they were normally civilianized. There was, and as you've seen with Brian, if you look at Brian's airplane, a lot of them have a bench seat put in the back, just so it's a 4 to 5 place airplane. But like I said, 501 of them were built. First one was November 42. Last one was June 45. And of course, the war ended just a few months later. 350 returned. To date, I've been able to identify 304 serial numbers of the ones that came back. 12 were lost in Royal Navy service. Of the 501, about 25, 26 are still flying today. And 9 of them overseas, 2 in the UK, France, Switzerland. 1 went all the way to Tahiti. And the last, Belgium, Czech Republic. So, any questions?
So do the radios in yours work?
You know, a friend of mine who was a radio ham guy, he got the receiver, the big receiver, to work, and he said, very bottom of the range, he could get like a little bit of a weather one. But I mean, one of the tubes was this long,
Yeah.
like about that big. It's huge. They're like 25 pounds a piece, those radios. You know, and what your cell phone does compared to what they
But they were all manufactured as 1819,
Correct.
and then the V77 is one, the designation when they were sold to civilians.
Actually, I've seen that designation on engineering documents when they were in the 40s, when it's still at Stinson. Yeah, when Vultee, I think that was their, 77th design. So some of the documents on like the engineering films show V77. And then the Air Corps gave it the 1819.
Have you ever run into is it a 50-gallon fuel tank that they had outside?
Yes, I've seen the fittings. And this one had where they'd cut them off. They were like little rings, and you could put a 55-gallon drum in back with a wobble pump up to the left tank. And the British originally designed it. That's where they kind of put some of the hardware in there. But then they couldn't figure out how to get more oil capacity. Because now you got too much fuel for the quantity of oil you got. They couldn't pump more oil into the tank. So the British said, well, nix that idea and throw that thing away. So yeah, you can see some of them that they've placed it in, but they never used it. Never happened.
You said they burn on a quarter of oil an hour?
And a good day.
What? Yours is overhauled, it still burns a quarter an hour?
Oh yeah, yeah.
That's engineered it. Adrian Beast,
Yeah.
engineered it, so.
Well, yeah.
It burns and blows.
Yeah. When you look at your oil consumption, it's more if it's sat for 2 weeks and then you go to start it, because it leaves a big old splooge on the ramp and down the side. If you're flying it every, say, 3 or 4 days, your oil consumption is less just because you're not losing that much, especially as you pull the prop through. You're not losing so much.
These wires.
Well, this one just finished. I've just done the first couple engine runs. So hopefully when we get back, when the weather settles down, then I'll fly this one.
You said it's got 161 hours
Total time, yeah. Yeah, I know.
And do you plan to fly it 10 hours a year or 100 hours a year or whatever?
Oh, it all depends on. You can make all the plans in the world, but I'd like to keep flying, at least to get, a good 50, 60 hours on the motor and get some good hard flight.
Try to keep it as low time as possible.
No, I'm just going to use it. I figure I'm already pushing 67, so you think, okay, if they're going to throw me out at 70, how much time can I get in 3 years?
Randy, as far as you know, is you're the only one that's being restored to the original condition?
As far as I know.
And everything?
Yeah. A lot of them were painted military, but with a civilian interior. But I tried to be as authentic on the inside, and even some of those connectors, they're Air Ministry connectors.
Wow.
The headset jacks are Air Ministry. Those radios were spec'd out for the plane.
Wow.
So all that stuff is right out of the drawing numbers of what needs to be there.
How did you go about finding the radios?
Funny, so I started hunting, because I've been working with this since '94. And when I first started, I sent out letters. You write on paper. because there's just the internet wasn't around. So this I sent one to one fella in Coventry, England, and he faxed back a thing. Well, I've got most of all of your stuff you needed. Wow. So I was still flying for the airline at the time, so I jump seated over to England, and this guy had all this stuff. And he's one of these guys. He had a huge warehouse hangar. He used to be a radio operator on the Connies back in the day. And I said, you know, I need a W56-7. And he thinks for a minute, and he walks down this aisle, down this aisle, down this aisle, reaches it far back, and pulls it out of some box. I can't find the wrench I just set down. I mean, how did this guy do this? But he had all this stuff. He had all the connectors. 95% was through him. And all the rest, now you can find it on eBay. Those radios are like hen's teeth. You can hardly find those 2 big box radios. The one on the rear bulkhead's available. You see that for sale occasionally, but not those 2 big ones. I've just never seen them since.
Are those helicopters?
No, they are. It's a British made. I don't even know who makes them, but it's a British company that made them. Yeah, so it's just a lot of cool. I like finding the history of most of the stuff as much as I do like flying the airplane.
Is Underwood still alive?
I believe so.
Did you talk with him much?
Early on.
Was his, I always wondered about that 350 number, if he really had a basis for that?
That 350 came from newspapers in '46 when they were advertising what was coming back. That's what the newspapers were saying at the time. It was 350. Of course, the media, you know, it's fake news. Any other questions? Radial engines, Oklahoma. Yeah, those guys. Yeah. So, and like I said, they're just gorgeous when they come back. I almost hate to get oil and grease on them.
So what kind of speed can I expect to see out of this?
105, 110 knots. And that'd be, yeah, 15 gallons. Yeah, but he's going to make more noise. And he'll leave oil all over you. Yeah.
Are we going to see it at Oshkosh?
Hope to. It all depends on how the first few runs go. And typical deal, the runway is closed for a month at home for resurfacing. And now I get back, it's going to be rainy for a few days, and then they're going to close it again for grooving. So it's like every time I try to go get it done, there's something in the way. So.
I have a buddy that had one that sold it about a month ago, and I was chasing him with my 108, and he seemed to be about $15 faster.
Oh, wow. Wow.
It's considerably faster than 108. I couldn't catch it unless I cut off one side of the turn.
Huh.
Does he still have it? He just sold it about a month ago.
Was that Andy?
Danny
Meyer? Yeah. That went over to Illinois here somewhere, didn't it?
Somewhere, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Some guy called him and wanted to come look at it on a Sunday. He's like, nah, but we got a Learjet headed that way. Can we come up? Yeah, I'll meet you at the airport.
That kind of money, you bet I'll be there.
And then we're going to check that day and send somebody else next week, I think, to get it. So,
Holy cow. Well,
and it was painted military colors, markings like yours.
yes. Yep.
Beautiful airplane. The interior wasn't done, but it was
Yeah.
a nice airplane.
Yeah.
So if you got 300 hours in a 108, what would it take to get checked out in a B77?
Sight picture. 4 or 5, a couple hours just to get the sight picture and the energy management. You know, it's 4,000 pound gross, so it's just figuring out how much energy you need in the flare. And probably in the first couple hours, your sight picture would be there. Then it's just managing energy in the flare and short final. It's such a docile airplane. I think the fellow you flew with, he compares it to a Super Cub. Flies better than a Super Cub, so. This one does not have it. And I had one prior to this that had it, and yeah, I flew it all the time without it, with it unlocked. A couple of times you're down there tugging on that thing, and you're doing all this on the runway. So and unless you're greater than a 10, 12 knot direct cross, you really don't need it. And I found out that much of a cross, I didn't even use flaps. I hardly use flaps anyways. No, because it seemed to block, to me, it seems to block the rudder a little bit. You just lose a little effectiveness from the prop wash. But flaps, yeah. Yeah. There have been guys trying to electrify them, but they can't get them to retract fast enough on a go-around.
How fast do they go up and down on that?
Pretty quickly. Yeah, they'll come down pretty good. And then, of course, between that flap retract spring, had to laugh at when he was talking about how difficult. Same thing on these, to put those things in. But between the spring and air load, they come up really quickly. And then there's a check valve if you lose the motor. told to vacuum in a tank in the back, so you can keep the operation of the flaps for them. So.
So it sounded like if we found one, you'd be the guy to do the pre-buy, huh?
Sure.
Bring it to Center Fund first.
Yeah, there you go. So yeah, go ahead.
I'll just make a comment. Randy's been extremely valuable in the restoration work we've been doing on our V77. He's got all kinds of data, drawings, knowledge. He's got parts, not all parts, but a lot of parts. And just I wouldn't do our back today without using it.
Oh.
That's an absolute fact.
No, it's just I'm so happy to even get these things in the air and help guys keep them in the air, because they're such a beautiful airplane. You know,
So I gotta confess too, so since we're having therapy here.
My name's Jody and I own an air.
I own two.
When I was approached about, or thinking about this one, I ran across, so I called Randy up, and I think we talked like 4 hours. It was like one evening, and it just, our conversation just kept going on, and since then, it's like, you know, every couple of weeks, I've got to call you back.
What did I do? Damn you. Exactly.
It's in Arkansas currently?
This one?
Yeah.
It's in Minnesota.
It's in Minnesota.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. South St. Paul.
Okay.
So that's the other thing. I only got a couple of months before the snow flies. So.
Yep. So tell me, Randy, on the SR, like the SR-10 with the same wing shape, I know that it's heat treated. Is everything other than that the same? With, the same ribs, the same?
As far as I know, the primary structure's the same.
It's the same.
I think the only thing that might change, I know the SR9 has got, and the SR8s have got different attached fittings to the fuselage than these did.
Okay.
The V77 is different. These are really beefed up because they had an SR9 come apart over in Europe, and the wings came off. And so you see a lot of documents on those airplanes where they had strut reinforcement. The other thing they kind of figured out is put together incorrectly over there, and put stress on the female side of the attach point, induced a crack, and of course that made the wing depart. But yeah, exactly. But I've seen some SR9 fuel tanks, and they look identical. You know, so I think predominantly they're the same way. Yeah, structure-wise and dimensions. Dimensions, I think they're exactly the same.
Any gallon fuel?
76. Oh.
So similar range to one way to.
Yeah. Yeah, usually, depending on how old you are, your bladder dictates range quicker than the airplane. You know, there are other limitations to consider.
But you can almost stand up and use a pillow pad.
Oh, you could. It's huge. Tons of room. So, all right. Thanks very much.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Guys, let's take 5 minutes